Hello and good afternoon. I'm Patty James of the Commonwealth Club Health and Medicine Member-Led Forum. It's my pleasure to extend a special welcome to any new members who are here today in this digital program mode. The Commonwealth Club continues to be a digital organization, and we will be for the coming months. I encourage our viewers to become members of the Commonwealth Club. To learn more about membership and its benefits, please visit the club at commonwealthclub.org. To support the club right now with a tax-deductible gift, please click the blue donate button on your screen. One quick note before I introduce today's guests. If you have a question for our guest, please post it in the YouTube chat area. Those questions will be forwarded to me during the program. Some of those questions I might ask as they come in, but a good portion of them will be towards the end of the program. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Gary Taubes. Gary Taubes is an investigative science and health journalist, the author of The Case for Keto, The Case Against Sugar, Why We Get Fat, and Good Calories, Bad Calories. Gary is a former staff writer for Discover and a correspondent for the journal Science. His writing has also appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, and Esquire, and has been included in numerous best of anthologies, including the Best of American Science Writing 2010. He has received 3 Science and Society Journalism Awards from the National Association of Science Writers. He is the recipient of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Investigator Award in Health Policy Research, as well as the co-founder and president of the nonprofit Nutrition Science Initiative. Gary lives in Oakland, California with his wife, author Sloan Tannen, and their 2 children. Welcome, Gary.
Patty, thank you for having me.
Yeah, I know this is great. I've obviously enjoyed your book. As you can see, I have many notes, and we won't be able to get to everything today because, for one thing, we want people to purchase your book and really delve into it. It's very interesting. So we don't know who's on this call today. You know, we might have people well-versed in keto who just want to hear what you have to say and want to ask questions because they agree or disagree with you. But we also might have people who know nothing about keto. They are here to learn from you. So with this in mind, please tell us a brief history of the ketogenic diet, for whom it was originally created, and then explain what ketosis actually is.
Okay, well, let me also just say the book is called The Case for Keto, but I'm not actually writing it for people who are well-versed in the keto diet because they don't need it. The argument I'm making is why this diet never goes away, why it's got such a long history, what the mechanism behind it is, and why medical professionals and anyone who suffers from overweight, diabetes, obesity, anything on that spectrum should seriously consider these sort of low carbohydrate, high fat eating patterns, which I'm lumping together with keto. The subtitle of this book is Rethinking Weight Control, the Science and Practice of Low Carbohydrate, High Fat Eating. And that's more on point than actually the title. So yeah, the ketogenic diet, I mean, it's got a long and glorious history, which is one of the bizarre aspects of it. You could go back to 1825. So a ketogenic diet is essentially a diet that restricts all the carbohydrate-rich foods. And so you don't eat sugars, you don't eat starches, you don't eat grains. Then you replace those calories with fat, and now, give or take a few grams of carbohydrates, you're either generating ketones, making it a ketogenic diet, or you're just eating a low carbohydrate, high fat diet. As a weight control device, you could go back to 1825. You're probably familiar with Jean-Antoine Briot-Savarant's The Physiology of Taste, the most famous book ever written about food. And in his book, Briot-Savarant says he's had conversations with 500 patients, 500 obese diners over the years, and they ask them what they eat and what they crave, and inevitably they crave carbohydrates, potatoes, rice, bread, and he decides that his diet for obesity is more or less rigid abstinence from those foods, and then you could eat as much as you want from anything else. It resurfaces in 1865 as the first most popular diet book ever written, the first best-selling worldwide diet book, a pamphlet written by a British undertaker, formerly obese, no longer, and named Banting. That by the end of the 19th century, it's embraced throughout Europe as the primary means to affect weight loss. You tell people not to eat carbohydrates. The theory is carbohydrates are fattening. So if you don't want to be overweight or obese, you don't eat these foods. Prior to insulin being discovered in 1921, the diet for the standard of care for patients with diabetes was what they called the animal diet. It was basically animal products and green leafy vegetables boiled 3 times to get all the carbohydrates out of them. The idea was diabetes is a disorder of carbohydrate intolerance, so people shouldn't eat that. It resurfaces in the 1960s. Well, it's studied in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s by physicians who are trying to figure out how to get their patients, and nutritionists and dietitians who are trying to figure out how to get people to lose weight without having to struggle with hunger constantly, because the assumption is if you're struggling with hunger, you're going to lose that battle eventually. In the 1960s, it's reborn first as a best-selling diet book called Calories Don't Count by a Brooklyn gynecologist named Herman Thaler, and then most famously Robert Atkins and his Atkins Diet Revolution. And virtually every other best-selling diet book is some version of a low-carb, high-fat, ketogenic diet. So Protein Power by Mike and Mary Dan Eads, a physician couple that was a massive bestseller in the 1990s. Sugar Busters is the same. South Beach is a sort of politically friendly version of this way to eat. The paleo diet is a version of a low-carb, high-fat diet. One of the reasons, again, in the case for keto, I'm trying to get people to understand that for 195 years, there has been a theory that the way you lose weight is not by eating less and exercising more, but by abstaining from carbohydrates. So that's the basis of it. More or less rigid abstinence to carbohydrate-rich foods, which is how Briat Saverman phrased it.
Now, isn't the Atkins diet, the keto diet is higher in fat and moderate in protein intake, and the Atkins diet is slightly higher in protein intake and lower in fat? Am I correct in that?
No, not really. Atkins just said don't eat. Atkins got in trouble. The reason he was excoriated by the medical community was he was the first physician who really embraced ketosis and suggested that his readers measure their ketone levels during using the urine strips that diabetics were using, and those people with diabetes at the time. So there are, and again, one of the points I'm trying to make in this book is there are always minor variations on this theme. So if you're a physician and you're struggling with, and nowadays every physician is struggling with this, particularly in family medicine and internal medicine, your waiting room is filling up with people who are in effect suffering from the negative sequelae of obesity, diabetes, hypertension. So they can't control their weight, they can't control their blood sugar, they can't control their blood pressure. And the job of a physician is now basically managing these diseases with prescriptions.
Yeah.
And so you want people to be able to lose weight. If you can solve the obesity problem, if you could solve the excess weight problem, you could solve the blood sugar and blood pressure problems with it. And if the conventional wisdom doesn't work, you look around, you find another, and nowadays the internet makes it possible to find any dietary approach. You might, and try them all yourself too. So you try a vegetarian diet and a Mediterranean diet and a DASH diet and a vegan diet. And eventually you come on some version of this. And like I said, there are all these different versions. But the problem is if it works and it works for your patients, and then you want to write a book about it, because you want to tell other people you've actually figured out weight loss and weight control. Let's call it healthy weight control. But you can't just write a book saying Atkins was right. I can do that as a journalist. I can say, I think Atkins was right. I think Mike and Mary Dan Eads were right. I think the Sugar Buster people were right. And I think they got something and understood something that the medical community in general missed. But if you're a physician, you can't do it. So you write your own diet book, you put your own spin on it. And then the media talks about how all these diets are different. So Atkins is different from keto, which is different from, protein power, all little bit subtle differences. But the reality is they're all fundamentally bound by this idea that the problem with modern diets is not how much people eat and how much they exercise or how little they exercise, but the carbohydrate content. And
now,
then,
the diet was originally created for children with epilepsy, correct?
it was, well,
In the
it
50s?
was given the ketogenic diet. Russell Wilder, who developed it, he was the endocrinologist at the Mayo Clinic back in the 1920s who pioneered using this diet for pediatric epilepsy. But the reason he used it for pediatric epilepsy is because it was being used for diabetes first. And he thought, isn't this interesting? Maybe since it seems so effective for at least most diabetes, not what we would call type 1 today, but type 2, the kind that associates with obesity, he saw reasons to test it on children. I forget if he might have seen a patient with diabetes who and epilepsy, who had had the epilepsy resolve on the diet. But that's why. So it's talked about as though it was started as a pediatric epilepsy diet, and it was known the keto diet per se, where you get 85-90% of your calories from fat, was pioneered for pediatric epilepsy by researchers at first Russell Wilder at the Mayo Clinic and then researchers at Johns Hopkins. But again, I am making the case for low carb, high fat diets and linking them with keto, and that's
That's the essence of it.
That's the essence.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Now, for those, again, since we're not really talking then to focusing as much on the people who are well versed, maybe an explanation for those who are just trying to figure all this out. Talk about insulin and your liver. Go through the physiology of this, if you would.
Okay, well, the idea is, so let's talk about the conventional wisdom on why people gain weight, okay? So what I think of as Newton's laws of obesity is you get fat when you take in more calories than you expend. Okay, you could find a sentence like this on virtually effectively every public health website in the world on their pages on obesity. And this idea grew out of research in the 1930s. It's considered to be sort of such a truism. It didn't need a birth, but it actually was a hypothesis that a researcher named Louis Newberg claimed to have proven in 1930. So the idea is, there's no metabolic defect in obesity. There's no abnormal growth phenomena going on that's driving you to accumulate fat when your lean friends might not. But it's all about how much you eat and exercise, in effect. And the essence of this theory is, the way I like to think of it is, the comedy team, we grew up with Abbott and Costello. When we were very young, it was Laurel and Hardy. And it's one thin guy and one person who we would say today is struggling with obesity. The thin guy was usually the straight guy. And the idea is that there's no difference between Abbott and Costello or Laurel and Hardy, except that the Hardy ate too much and Costello ate too much. And
okay.
The other two didn't.
I've not heard that analogy, but I can see the whole thing in my head. So there you go.
I mean, you could say the difference between Roseanne Barr, for instance, and Twiggy, by our current thinking on obesity, is that Roseanne Barr eats too much and Twiggy didn't. Twiggy was a model when I was a child.
Yeah.
Again, I'm using Kate Moss So this is a conventional wisdom. One of the things I've done in my writing and other researchers have done, and what my writing has been aimed at, and the case for keto is arguing, is that we have a theory of obesity that completely leaves out all physiological regulation of fat accumulation. Okay, so just like your height is determined by hormones and enzymes that, secreted from the pituitary gland, and everything in your body is very well regulated. Fat tissue is also very well regulated. And this science was worked out between the 1930s and the 1960s, when the tools became available to do it. And what physiologists and biochemists and endocrinologists learned is that your fat tissue is regulated by the hormone insulin. Okay, so you secrete insulin, your pancreas secretes insulin in response to the carbohydrates you're consuming. And then insulin keeps your blood sugar under control. It tells your muscle cells and your organs to sort of facilitates the uptake of glucose, blood sugar, so that they do a better job of keeping blood sugar under control. But it also tells your fat tissue to hold on to fat. So while you're secreting insulin, your fat tissue is holding on to fat. And as long as insulin stays elevated, it's inhibiting the release of fat from your fat tissue. And all of this was worked out pretty well by around 1965. Okay, so if you just ask the question, what makes a fat cell fat? So if you're overweight or you're obese, your body is full of all these overstuffed fat cells that have taken up too many calories and they won't give them up. And you ask the question, what makes the fat cell do that? The answer is basically elevated insulin. So if you want to get fat into a fat cell and keep it there, you upregulate insulin. If you want to get fat out of a fat cell, you have to lower insulin. And this is textbook medicine, but it's always been left out of all our discussions on obesity, because in obesity, particularly by the 1960s, the obesity community had decided that we get fat because we eat too much. And the field was dominated by psychologists and psychiatrists who were trying to figure out how to get people who suffer from obesity to eat less. They didn't care about endocrinology. They didn't care about the hormonal regulation of fat cells because that's not their field. They don't read the journals. They don't go to the conferences. Their field is human behavior. That's all they cared about. So we came up with an obesity theory dominated by this idea that people who suffer from obesity behave badly. They eat too much. They exercise too little. And what I'm bringing back, and others with our work, all those promoting these low-carb, high-fat diets, is the idea that this is a physiological disorder of excess fat accumulation. Fat accumulation is regulated by the hormone insulin. And if you want to get fat out of your fat cells and burn it, which is what we all want to do, you have to lower insulin. And the way you lower insulin is by abstaining from carbohydrates. The way I said in my first book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, by mid-1960s, the physiologists had proven that insulin was a principal regulator of fat metabolism. That's a quote from the two researchers, Rosalind Yalow and Solomon Bersin. Yalow won the Nobel Prize later for the work that led to that. So insulin's a primary regulator of fat metabolism, and the conventional wisdom was that carbohydrates were fattening. And we secrete carbohydrates and we secrete insulin in response to the carbohydrates. So in an ideal world, the medical establishment would have said, bingo, we figured out why people get fat. And now we know what they have to do if they want to get lean again, which is they have to abstain from these foods that make us secrete insulin. And they just never did it. They never did it, in part because the world was full of thin doctors who thought people get fat because they eat too much.
Well, I'm going to read you a thread that I just happened to come upon on Twitter yesterday. And this is, it was geared towards those with type 2 diabetes, but it's very much tied into what you just said. So the one person, it was a discussion, if you want to call anything that happens on Twitter a discussion. Sometimes it is, but not generally speaking. It was about carbohydrates. The one person who was a doctor stated that, quote, type 2 diabetes is a chronic carbohydrate overload. And the response from somebody who was not a doctor, but it said he was master's degree in something, didn't say what. And the response was, no, it is not, saying type 2 diabetes is a chronic calorie overload. Scientific studies were quoted on both. So back to that person, who's trying to figure this out. We hear what you just said, and then we see these two educated people who both have scientific studies, one saying it's not carbs, it's calories, one saying it's carbs. So what's the average person? It's like they're getting pulled in every direction. Who do they believe?
Okay, well, it's a very good question. So one of the, and what's interesting about that debate, and my next book is about diabetes only, and I'm obsessed with the history here. And this exact same debate was going on, and I could read you a quote from a Harvard diabetologist named Fred Allen circa 1919, saying all of the discussion on diabetes comes down to whether it's a calorie problem or a carbohydrate problem. Mm-hmm. Fred Allen thought it was a calorie problem. Other researchers thought it was a carbohydrate problem. Who do you believe? So since the first time I got into this, I'm an investigative journalist. Why listen to a journalist when there are all these doctors out there? But the problem is, well, there's several issues. One is obesity and diabetes rates keep going up, okay, in this country and around the world. The former head of the World Health Organization a few years ago at a National Academy of Sciences meeting in Washington said it was a slow motion catastrophe what's happening worldwide. This was before COVID, a less slow motion catastrophe. When COVID passes, the obesity and diabetes epidemics will still be there wreaking havoc. All of these people have been bombarded with the conventional thinking throughout their life. Eat less, exercise more. It's what they do. So if you suffer from this disorder, if you have trouble controlling your weight or your blood sugar, and you've never tried to eat less and exercise more, then I'm assuming I can't reach you because you're not interested enough. For those people who have gotten past that and say, well, that doesn't work for me. I'm hungry all the time. I can keep it up for a month or two and then I binge eat and fall off the wagon. I yo-yo diet, everything we do. The argument is pretty simple. When I started writing about this 20 years ago, keto was Atkins then, or Atkins and Sugar Busters and Protein Power and even the Zone a little bit. The idea was they were fad diets, they were quackery, and they would kill you. When I first wrote about this in a cover story in the New York Times Magazine, I described my experiment eating Atkins, and sitting at a diner in New York where I lived at the time, having eggs and bacon for breakfast and waiting to have a heart attack. That was the idea. This would clog your arteries and kill you. In the 20 years since then, there have probably been more studies done on low-carb, high-fat, ketogenic diets than any diet pattern in history. There's over 100 that have been completed and another 100 or so that are in the works. And the one thing we know for sure is it's safe, it's benign or beneficial. Virtually every disease state on which it's tested, it has some benefit. And when it's compared to other dietary approaches, it tends to do better than all of them. Not a lot better, because in these studies, people don't stick to these diets. But when they are told to abstain from carbohydrates and eat as much calories as they want otherwise, they tend to lose more weight and their heart disease risk factors improve. So getting back to your question, who do you believe? You don't have to believe any of us. You can try it yourself.
No. Okay. So okay. Now then the next, it's a series of 4 questions. You've actually answered a couple of them.
Yeah, I apologize. You warned me about that before we started.
It's okay.
And I warned you that I'm bad at this. I talk too much.
Because we have some questions that have come in that are going to, so the ketogenic diet has been voted the worst diet 3 years running. I'm sure you've heard that. Okay, so I wanted to address 4 concerns. I was thinking about this till 2 a.m. last night, how to phrase the last question in particular. So you've already talked a little bit. So one of their big concerns is the saturated fat, and this kind of goes into one of our questions from our viewers here too. So they're saying that it's too much meat, too high in saturated fat, which raises LDL cholesterol. And I know and that's true, right? Yes. But they also say that's a marker for heart disease. Now, you've covered a little bit so that's the first one. So kind of briefly, you've already talked about that, but kind of briefly answer that question. Saturated fat, LDL cholesterol, heart disease. And LDL, and if you would, being a nutritionist, I'm always having this conversation with my doctor about why do they check LDL and not C-reactive protein? Inflammatory markers for heart disease are probably better markers. But tell us about heart disease and saturated fat.
Okay, so I got into this field in the 90s, and my background is physics. My first 2 books are about physics and nuclear chemistry and researchers who got the wrong results, okay? Researchers who screwed up publicly, and I got to document how they screwed up and why they screwed up. My second book was called Bad Science. And I like to think, if nothing else, no matter what people think about my nutritional wisdom, I know more about bad science than any human being alive, okay? By virtue of having written 2 detailed case studies. I got into nutrition because my friends in the physics community, of whom I had many, said that if I was interested in bad science, I should look at the stuff in public health. So this was the early 90s. They said the stuff in public health is terrible, and they were right. It turns out it is. And by terrible, I mean, it's in order to get the right answer in science, it's what I learned from my first 2 books. You need a certain rigorous, critical, skeptical approach to the research, a relentlessly honest, rigorous, skeptical approach. In virtually all of my books, I quote the Nobel laureate Richard Feynman, who said, the first principle of science is you must not fool yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool. So I started writing about public health issues for the journal Science as a correspondent in the 90s. And by the late 90s, I had stumbled serendipitously, as it seems, into nutrition. First with this idea that we get hypertension because of the salt content of our diet. And I spent 9 months working on a story in which I interviewed, I think it was 85 researchers for one magazine story. And then while I was doing that, one of the worst scientists I'd ever interviewed, and remember, my second book was called Bad Science. I thought I had interviewed the worst scientists in the world. One of the worst scientists I ever interviewed took credit not just for getting Americans to eat less salt, but for putting us on the low-fat diet that we were all eating through the 90s, and many of us are still eating. So I spent a year working on that. One magazine article, one entire year for Science, 140 researchers and administrators interviewed. I read stacks and stacks of documents. I even hired epidemiologists, researchers who had never stepped into this quagmire before to read documents for me. And the reality is the science is terrible. This belief that saturated fat causes heart disease is not supported by the evidence.
Okay, and we're going to leave it at that. That was the soundbite I was looking for.
And let me just say, back then I had no bias, other than I was skeptical of bad science. But I ate what everyone else ate. I had no book deals. I wasn't looking for book deals. All I wanted to do was find the truth. And it turns out, I'm just going to finish. It comes down to 5, 6 maybe trials done in the 1960s and 1970s that were ambivalent.
Okay.
And everything after that has been the sort of public health establishment saying, we've been saying it all along, it must be right.
Yeah. I remember the whole low fat thing in the 80s when my kids were little, and I didn't buy into it. I'm rather proud of myself, actually.
You should be.
So and we have some questions here, but I want to get through my 4 points first before we go to these questions. And their second point is it's insufficient in dietary fiber, which is needed for gut health and health in general. So briefly, talk about dietary fiber and a keto diet.
Well, is it needed for gut health? How do you know that?
Biome.
Well, there is a gut biome, but there are populations that seem to thrive eating virtually no dietary fiber at all.
That's true. And the
Maasai warriors. I hate to bring these up. But
that's okay. I've got a photo of the Maasais on my wall right here. Yes.
Yeah, these debates were had in the 1920s and 1930s. That's one of the issues. That's when you know you've got a problem with the science, when the same debates, the same experiments even are done over and over again. But researchers actually did experiments where they locked away 2 explorers they had them eat a fiber-free diet for a year. A guy named Stefansson, famous Arctic explorer, and his partner Anderson. So they lived for a year on meat only, 0 fiber. And then 10 of the leading nutritionists in the world published a report on this. This was 1928-29. Literally 10 of the leading researchers in the world published, I think it was from 8 to 12 reports total, I forget. And after a year without fiber, these guys were healthier than they'd ever been in their lives.
Okay. Wouldn't be me. I just love vegetables.
Well, you like it. Everybody loves it. Here's the other issue, which is nobody's saying don't eat green vegetables.
Oh, I know. I'm just one image.
I'm not advocating carnivore. I'm just being
You don't need
intellectually honest enough to admit that the carnivore diet fascinates me. There are these guys walking around out there who eat zero vegetable matter. They're supposed to be dead from scurvy, let alone whatever's going on with, and they are in extraordinary health. I've met some of these people.
Okay.
And actually,
that's okay. I know.
The other thing is classic low carb, high fat ketogenic diet, lots of meat. For ethical reasons, people have problems with that. For environmental reasons, it could be a problem.
But that's number 4. Don't go into that right now, okay? Okay. I want to spend some time on that.
You're still eating plenty of green leafy vegetables. Okay. You're eating your broccoli. You're eating the vegetables you like. You're eating salads.
Sure.
You're just not eating potatoes, grains, sugars.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. Third point, and again, please do this as briefly as you can, because point 4 is important. and before I take these, and that is, and endless people saying it's not sustainable. You can't do it. There's no air around you. You can't go out to dinner. You can't do this. So what about the sustainability aspect? And I have a good friend, JD Griffin. I think I introduced him to you. He's been keto and he teaches it.
So he sustains it.
He sustains it.
So it's sustainable.
He sustains it really well. And he teaches it,
let's go back to the basis of keto. The basis of keto is carbohydrates. For those of us who fatten easily, a term I admit I'm borrowing from the 1950s diet books. Some of us fatten easily, some of us don't. Some of us can eat whatever they want, however much they want. They'll stay lean as West Kansas coyotes was a phrase that was, I quote in my book, right out of Congress in 1967. The rest of us, we look at a piece of bread, it goes right to our hips. That's another expression from the 1960s. So for those of us who fatten easily, carbohydrates are the problem. And the mechanism goes through the hormone insulin, other hormones as well, but primarily insulin. So if we don't want to gain weight, or we want to be at a healthy weight, we want to be at the healthiest weight possible for us, we can't eat these foods. In the same way, if I don't want to get lung cancer, a former smoker, cannot smoke cigarettes. There was a period in my life where I would have told you not smoking is unsustainable. I lived in New York. The world was full of smokers everywhere I went. But if I wanted to be healthy, I had to abstain from cigarettes. The argument here is those people who suffer with, overweight, obese, who have trouble controlling their blood pressure, their blood sugar, and their weight, have to more or less rigidly abstain from carbohydrates. And then they're not sustaining their diet, they're sustaining their health. Your friend JD wants to stay healthy. That's why he
actually competes in physical stuff.
And the people who say this,
I don't remember what it's called.
Because we've all done the other diets. We've all spent years trying to eat less and exercise. I used to go on sushi diets when I was younger. Anyone who struggles with their weight basically spends their adult years trying to diet. If you find something that works, by which I mean you lose excess weight easily and you're not hungry, I can guarantee you that if you understand it, you'll sustain it.
Okay. I could go down a rabbit hole here, but we don't have time to do it. About, when I grew up, there were no fat kids. There were no obese children.
No, there were a few.
But I don't remember any of them. But then I grew up in the country, and there might have been a couple, but it wasn't, Anyway, I don't want to.
So something has changed. That's another way to look at it. Something has changed dramatically, and the question is what?
Well,
so the conventional wisdom is the food industry made more food available, and it's very tasty food, and people just ate too much. And those of us who struggle with obesity can't say no. So we have a willpower thing. And the conventional wisdom, by the way, is the invention of, it's the reason why fat shaming exists. because those of us who gain weight easily apparently just can't control our appetites, whereas lean people can. That's the thinking. The alternative hypothesis, the basis of books like The Case for Keto, is that we change the type of carbohydrates we consume.
Yeah, you go into
we dose the nation in sugar, as your friend Robert Lustig will tell us.
Yeah, I know. He's speaking for me when his new book comes out in May, by the way.
Yeah, and refined flours and processed carbohydrates, and and our brilliant public health administrators started telling the whole nation that the reason we get fat is because of the fat in our diet, not the carbohydrates.
Yeah.
So one of the things that shifted from when we were kids to now is when we were kids, the conventional wisdom was that carbohydrates were fattening: bread, pasta, potatoes, beer. All make you fat. If you don't want to be fat, you don't eat them. And then by the 1980s, carbohydrates had been transformed into heart-healthy diet foods. So now if you had a problem with your weight, which much of the nation started to have, you did exactly the opposite of what our parents would have done, our mothers would have done. So in 1960, say, if you have a problem with your weight, you don't eat potatoes or pasta or bread. In 1985 and onward, if you have a problem with your weight, you don't eat, butter and animal products and saturated fat-rich foods. Instead, you eat potatoes, pasta, bread.
Yeah.
And we just got fatter and fatter. So those are sort of another way to look at the calories versus carbohydrate issue on a historical scale.
Okay, and one question, and this might come as a little harsh, but I have to ask it, and then we have to hit these questions. And if we have time, I'd like to go back into the willpower a little bit. And okay, for me, maybe just, and I think for other people too, the biggie is that, and you reference it in your book, but it's the environmental impact of this. And you say, and I don't know, I'm paraphrasing you here now, but you basically say that you can't tell somebody what they can eat or not eat. It's really up to them and how they feel. And I agree with that. However, we're in the middle of a climate catastrophe right now. It's not climate change. The climate's always changed. We have global warming issue, and agriculture is part of that. I mean, my niece and her husband are farmers, but they're very much into carbon sequestering. And I follow the Savory Institutes, all their articles on grass-fed beef and carbon sequestering. But let's be real here. The beef in our food supply is not from that. It's feedlots and this horrible, and it's without even getting into, just a second, almost done. Without even getting to, I just got to finish my preamble. It's not only the animals, but it's the people who work there, and then we have pigs who never get off the cement, and just this horrible. Wouldn't we be better? And in fact, it was really interesting that I subscribed recently to Mark Bittman's his new thing, the Bittman Project. He said, legumes are the world's most important source of protein, bar none. That's a quote. Grains are the staple of humanity and have been for 10,000 years. Rice and beans could save the world. So that person's choice to eat all this meat, all this bacon, all this dairy, there's
nothing in my book saying, okay, two issues that we're conflating here. Okay. I am arguing that carbohydrates are fattening.
Okay, yes.
And that for many Americans, from say 30 to 88% of them, they have to dramatically restrict the carbohydrate content of their diet if they want to be healthy.
Yeah.
Okay?
Okay.
So that's the context. When people argue about the environmental impact of beef, they're assuming that people, again, it's a kind of fat shaming. The assumption is people who get obese get that way because they eat too much. They could eat less of anything. This is what Mark Bittman's saying, and I know Mark and I like him immensely, but he's basically saying, look, if I can maintain my weight eating rice and beans, so can anyone. So that's what they should eat. And I'm arguing that's not true. The foods that lean people can eat to stay healthy are foods that will make me hungry, fatter, and unfortunately, let's not get into legumes. But it's sort of, so the issue is, let's just put it this way. Let me phrase it for you as a question. I know you've got children. Let's say one of your children struggles with obesity. So they're 12 years old and they struggle with obesity. Okay. And they're going to be diabetic by the time they're 16. Okay. Then they're going to be on insulin for the rest of their life. Okay. We could probably control it. Maybe bariatric surgery will solve it. You know, as a mother, that you could make them healthy by eating a low carb, high fat ketogenic diet. What are you going to do?
Absolutely. I'm not arguing.
Okay. So all I'm arguing is that mother, every mother out there should know that this is a possibility. And that this is what their kids need to be healthy. You can't tell them not to eat meat because of the environment. They can buy carbon offset. I mean, that, they can walk to work. You can sacrifice. You can bring your footprint down other ways. But for some of us, we may have to eat like this.
But for the people who don't have to eat like this, I mean, I went into the bookstore the other day and there's so many books on keto by far. So not everybody needs to be on it. So I'm just saying, for those whose health relies on it, absolutely. We don't know what proportion of the population that is. That's what I was going to ask you.
So this is what, and again, if you look at the number of Americans who are metabolically, have a metabolic disorder. So it's again, they have trouble controlling blood pressure, blood sugar, and obesity. We're talking close to 90%. Okay. Now, many of them, again, when I talk in the book about more or less rigid abstinence from carbohydrates, some of them just improve the quality of the carbs. Like Rob Lustig gets rid of the sugar. Everyone will be healthier. Stop drinking sugary beverages. Cut back on the beer. That'll solve a lot of problems, but it's not enough for many people. And that's the issue. And it's sort of, a lot of our thinking about the environmental issues and the ethical issues are based fundamentally on this idea that this is the healthiest way to eat. So people like Peter Singer, the Princeton philosopher, who argues against, the ethics of animal agriculture and the utilization of animals for human needs and pleasure. I mean, Peter Singer's a very smart guy. Peter Singer thinks that the healthiest diet is a diet that's plant-based. And that's that thinking is very ingrained out here in the Bay Area. It may indeed be wrong for most of us. So I'm in a very awkward position, right? Because I now I've stumbled into this career where I'm the boy saying, look, we're telling everyone to eat plant-based diets, and it is not necessarily benign. They've never been tested the way they should be. And then we back it up by saying you're doing, you're singling your virtue with the environment if you're eating this way, and you're singling your virtue with the ethics if you're eating this way. But my primary concern is that people get to be healthy and they get the right advice to be healthy. And the reason I wrote this book is so that they could read it and say, if this is true, I can try it. I could see what happens, and then I can decide for myself what kind of sacrifices I want to make for the environment.
Because we all need to, right?
We all need to. We're completely in agreement there. We have Houston, we have a problem.
Right. But, okay, so anyway, I knew that's a tricky subject, and I understand that because I want people to feel good, strong, healthy, but I also have major concerns about my own grandchildren and what their world is going to be like in 50 years. So
as do I. I'm more worried about artificial intelligence.
Okay. So
I would like them to have jobs.
That would be nice. I have more questions that they enjoy. There you go. I think you answered the first question about for those of us who do better without carbs, are we missing anything, or should we be concerned about anything, any life expectancy changes? You went into depth about, I think, and since this question came in way in the beginning, I think you've,
let me say just quickly.
Okay.
It's an interesting question. The argument, the case for keto here is that if you abstain from carbohydrates and replace those calories with the healthy fats, you'll be healthier. Might take you a while to make the transition because you're transitioning your body from running on glucose, a carbohydrate, to running on fatty acids. But eventually you'll be healthier. Maybe then you'll feel better and you'll have more energy and your weight will come under control. But I can't tell you that you'll live longer.
Yeah.
Nobody can tell you that you'll live longer because those trials, those experiments don't exist.
Right. No
So all
longer.
we could say is you'll feel healthier. And if you do, I want you to understand that there are risks and benefits involved with anything you do. An example I use is if somebody tells you to go running
Yeah.
to get healthier, which is a universally accepted as good advice, doesn't mean you're not going to end up needing a knee replacement 10 years sooner because you were a runner than if you weren't. So they're always, what we know is that there's copious clinical trials saying this will make you feel better. It'll help you control your weight, your blood sugar, your blood pressure. They'll all get better.
Okay.
Will you live longer? Geez, I hope so.
Yeah. Yeah, right. All this longevity stuff now kind of makes me nuts, Ashley.
It makes me nuts also.
Oh, good. Because it's like, let's live our time on this earth as healthy as we can and then leave this earth when we're supposed to and, leave all the resources for the next generation.
It's how 40-year-olds or 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds and 40-year-olds think before they get to be 80 and 90-year-olds.
Or 63.
64 and a half.
Okay, the next question. What about hydration issues with keto? Briefly, because we have quite a few more questions.
When you give up, when you abstain from carbohydrates, when you go on any diet, your body will, you'll lose water weight. That's your body burning through glycogen stores in the liver and the water that's stored with it. It helps to drink a lot of water. Clinical experience and clinical trials over the years suggest that it helps to drink broth, and even salty broths, because you lose a lot of salt with the water that you're losing.
Yeah,
so your urine, your kidney flushes away sodium. It's cramping often tends to be a problem when you eat this way. But so you replace sodium, magnesium, drink broth, drink water.
Okay. Is there a relationship? And by the way, before we go on, one thing, and we won't talk about it now because this is, you talk about the keto flu and, some of the reactions that people might have when they first start the keto diet. But anyway, so, okay. Is there a relationship between keto and brain functioning, memory?
People say there is. Hard to tell. My memory stinks, but I've had multiple concussions in my youth. So would it be worse if I was eating differently? There's no way to tell. There's a lot of research in these areas. There's a lot of theories. Everyone's got a mechanism to explain why memory could be better, or this could even, the clinical trial was just published the other day suggesting that a ketogenic diet helps restore some cognitive function in Alzheimer's disease. I saw
that.
Yeah, there's a lot of, pick a disease state and somebody is trying a clinical ketogenic diet to see if it makes it better.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting experiment because, like I said, you're changing the fuel your body runs on. And right. Fuel use is so integral to all human functions that it's sort of like, let's see what happens. Yeah. Change my brain from running on glucose to running on fatty acids and ketones and glucose. Maybe that'll help my memory. I can't tell you that it helped mine, but like I said.
So has the food pyramid impacted our understanding of these issues? Oh my goodness. So, okay, I won't answer that. What do you think?
Okay, read my first book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, or the articles I did for Science. Nina Teicholz's wonderful book, The Big Fat Surprise. The story, the gist of the story is, I have trouble telling a short story. Nutritionists went from studying deficiency diseases that they could test, right? If somebody's suffering from the absence of a vitamin B and they've got beriberi or pellagra, you can give them the vitamin and see what happens. They went from doing that to post-World War II studying chronic diseases, where you look to see maybe something you're eating instead of something absent in your diet, something present in your diet is causing a long-term chronic disease state, and they couldn't test that. So they did some pretty poor studies. Like I said, these are the 5 or 6 clinical trials I mentioned, short-term, and then they embraced the idea that dietary fat was bad for us. And then they enshrined that in a series of government documents in the 80s, the USDA and its dietary guidelines, and then the food pyramid. And all of this pushed us to a diet. If you remember the food pyramid, the base of the diet was
bread,
pasta, bread, rice, grains,
right.
All the foods that I'm saying are uniquely fattening. So if I'm right, the food pyramid was a public health disaster of perhaps unprecedented experience. I could be wrong.
Yeah. There's lots of pyramids. I mean, there's old ways, the old ways they have their for different native populations. There's a Mediterranean diet.
Even old ways with their native populations. They never pick the Plains Indians or the Maasai or Inuit.
Right. No, they didn't know. So, okay.
Can we look at all the evidence and not just the evidence that support? When I talk about bad science, one of the characteristics of bad science is you select out only the evidence that agrees with you and you ignore the rest.
Sure. Cherry picking.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and the funny thing is every scientist has to do that, but it's to the extreme in bad science. Okay.
Please speak to the pathway from dietary fat to stored fat. And then 2 more questions after that one. And then another one.
Dietary fat. We actually store the fat we eat. This was one of the things that drove, oddly enough, the wrong dietary approach. When you eat a mixed meal, the fat you eat is stored in your adipose tissue while your body, and the protein ideally is used to rebuild tissues and cells. And the body struggles to deal with the carbohydrates. The difference between, this was a number that stunned me. When somebody with a healthy blood sugar has something like, I hope I'm remembering this correctly, a teaspoon worth of glucose in their blood at any one time, and then a diabetic blood sugar is like a teaspoon and a half. So that's a difference between about 16 and 24 calories worth of carbohydrates. And you might eat at a meal between the bread and the potatoes and the orange juice, say 400 or 500 calories. So that's a kind of metabolic tsunami for your body that has to deal with it somehow. So it prioritizes burning through the carbohydrates. And that's what insulin does. You secrete insulin. The insulin tells your cells, take up the carbs and burn them, because high blood sugar is toxic and dangerous. And while it does that, it tells your body to hold on to dietary fat. So back in the 60s and 70s, as researchers were realizing that we store the fat we eat, they thought, well, that makes sense. So if we tell people to eat less fat, they'll store less fat. But it's actually the wrong problem. The problem is that it's the carbohydrates that regulate the storage of the fat that we eat through the hormone insulin. So the way to have less fat stored is to eat fewer carbohydrates and have less insulin. And then again, that was the exact wrong advice we gave people.
Yeah. Oof. Okay. This next one's interesting. I don't know. I think the first one I did on food addiction was in 2009 with Dr. Vera Tarman, Dr. Tarman and Dr. Nicole Lavina, and of course, Dr. Robert Lustig. And it was all kind of based on Michael Prager's book, Fat Boy, Thin Man. And it was on food addiction. And they're all very into this world. Michael tells a story, and he said, he's just a person. He's not a scientist, but he tells a story about just being absolutely hooked on popcorn, lots of butter, lots of salt, popcorn. And so he told himself he was only going to have popcorn when he went to the movies. Well, guess what? He started going to the movies every night. I know. So his point is food addicting for him? Absolutely. So there's a lot of people in this world, but the question was not to me, it was to you. Is sugar, and then he has in parentheses, carbs, addictive?
My answer is, if you actually look at the science, I don't find the evidence very compelling. It wasn't studied. This is one of those issues that simply wasn't studied for 30, 40 years because we had established that dietary fat was a problem and heart disease and people ate too much. That was why obesity was about. So there was one group at Princeton in the United States studying the possibility that sugar was addicting, Bart Hovel's group, and nobody else for the most part. There was a group in France. I think there was a Canadian researcher. The French research was interesting because I think they demonstrated beyond a shadow of a doubt that sugar is more addictive than heroin or cocaine for rats. Okay? But we're not rats.
Yeah. No.
So the research just wasn't done, but here's one of these areas where I think, geez, if you have kids or you have a sweet tooth, do you really need some scientist to tell you whether or not it's addictive or not?
No, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that, some people just can't handle sugar. They can't have one cookie. They're going to eat a dozen of them.
Exactly. And it's by the way, I'm one of them. What you need the addictive science for is if you want to regulate against it. If you want to go after it like we went after the cigarette industry, then it helps to know beyond a shadow of a doubt scientifically, with copious, rigorous evidence that it causes addiction. And if you know how to do it, that'll help as well. But for the rest of us, it's like, you know or you don't. And if you have kids, you don't need the science.
Yeah. And I think part of this, it's crossed my mind this whole time we're talking, is that, when people are going to try this on themselves, and I told you the other day, Gary, that I tried it because I try everything for 3 weeks. I mean, I try everything because I want to be
3 weeks isn't long enough.
I know it's not. I know, but I know, but I've tried everything just to have some sort of semblance of what people might be going through. I did vegan. Somebody got me some book anyway. I did vegan for about 2.5 weeks, and I eat vegan a lot of the time, quite frankly, but not all the time. So when I dreamt of a tuna fish sandwich, my body was telling me, okay, that's it. And so I was done. But people have a little bit lost the ability to get the cues from their body. Are you bloated? How's your skin? Whatever. How do you feel? Do you have energy? Just being able to tune in to how your body feels. I think if people would really kind of just not like the book I was telling you about, that Michael Prager, he would just stuff food in his mouth and not even know he was full for a long time. And then he would lay on the ground and keep stuffing because he could stuff more in. I mean, there are people who are like that. But
is Michael overweight?
Not anymore. That's why his book was called Fat Boy, Thin Man. But he still has to watch what he, So, okay, so those are the questions. But one more. We've got a few more minutes. I'd like to talk, because we've covered a little bit about willpower. And I go back to, the Stanford study with the kids and the marshmallows. What was that, in the 50s or 60s? And, the kids, I think everybody's heard this. And one day I'm going to get a T-shirt that says, "Don't eat the marshmallows." I know they're out there. But the kids were given a marshmallow, and they were told, don't eat the marshmallow. If you don't eat the marshmallow, you can have a second one when we come back in 15 minutes. And then, that's delayed gratification. It's willpower. And then they tracked these kids and found out the kids who left the marshmallow there and waited to the second one did better in a lot of aspects of their life. So that is the long preamble for willpower. Somebody told me once, willpower is like a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets. And in your book,
that was a thin person.
I don't remember. It was a long time ago. But you talk about the two friends walking down the street and going by the bakery, and oh my gosh, it smells good. The one friend just says, "Yeah, it does," and kept walking. The other one is just, nobody got a hook and pulled him in the bakery, but he walked in and he ate however many. And so willpower is and I'm just throwing this out there. Okay. Have we lost a little bit of willpower, or is it almost impossible with the junk that is in our food system now?
So the idea, and again, one of the problems with what I and others have been arguing for the past 20 years is that we're basically saying that the obesity research community went off the rails, just as the heart disease people went off the rails with saturated fat and heart disease. The obesity people went off the rails when they decided obesity was caused by eating too much. Because concepts like willpower are concepts that exist only in the sense of people eating too much. Mm-hmm. So if you have a theory that says obesity is a physiological disorder, that's a fat accumulation disorder, that's centered around the hormone insulin, in which insulin's a principal regulator, then you could explain phenomena like willpower as being the result of basically insulin signaling issues in the body. And this is the reason I use that example in the book. So it's a person with obesity and a lean friend walking down the street, and they smell, or through the airport, they smell the Cinnabon stores. And I'm sure Cinnabon has a fan blowing the air out.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so the fellow has obesity, is insulin resistant. That means his cells are resistant to the hormone insulin, so he's over-secreting insulin in response to stimuli from the environment. And if he smells something that tells him that there's a carbohydrate out there to be eaten, his pancreas will respond by secreting insulin in preparation for the carbs to be consumed. It's called the cephalic phase insulin response. If I start talking about hot donuts, beignets, I used to eat these when I lived in France, I will not only start salivating, which I'm doing, I will start secreting insulin in response. The insulin tells my fat tissue to hold on to fat, and it tells the blood sugar to take up, the liver to take up any glucose and store it as glycogen. And so it empties the circulation of available fuels, and it creates hunger. The French have a phrase that hunger begins with the meal. Hunger is the best sauce is another one that comes from Don Quixote. It'll make you hungry. So the fellow with obesity who's insulin resistant will instantly get hungry upon smelling the Cinnabon in a way that his lean friend will not.
Yeah, he can.
So now you've got the equivalent of two people walking down. They both might have eaten 2 hours before, but it's as though the person with obesity hasn't eaten in 12 hours or 24 hours. And now he knows there's food in there.
Right.
And food that his body wants to metabolize, because when insulin's elevated, you're only metabolizing carbohydrates. So the idea is he goes in to that store because of what's happening physiologically in his body, not because he lacks willpower.
Yeah.
The lean person can't imagine how hungry that person with obesity has just become. And if, as I said in the book, if the lean person goes into the store and has a cinnamon bun, nobody judges him, right? Because he's lean.
Yeah.
You don't say he lacked willpower because he's lean. You only say the obese person did.
Yeah.
So again, it's the whole concept of willpower. And this is my problem with books like Michael Prager's or David Kessler's The End of Overeating. It's based on concepts that, unfortunately, I don't believe were correct when they were embraced. And it left out entire fields of science, the field of physiological psychology, which studied how fundamental behaviors, Pavlov was one of the founders of that field, and how fundamental behaviors are caused by underlying physiological states. And you could explain all of this with that science, but we didn't want to explain it because we knew that fat people ate too much, and that's all we needed to say.
Yeah. Well, I think for all that discussion, we've only really scratched the surface of all the information in here. So I recommend everybody read this, and because it is fascinating. There's lots of room for, conversation. So with this, our thanks today to Gary for his comments here today, as well as for those listening to the recording. This program and more like it will soon be posted on the club's website at commonwealthclub.org. And now the meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California commemorating the 118th year of enlightened discussion is adjourned.